started in hard times to bring us all in, into the laughter through thick and through thin, for public power enthusiasts without...
I'm Ahlmahz Negash, a principal resource planning analyst for Tacoma Power, an energy systems researcher, and an energy justice enthusiast.
I'm Paul Dockery, a senior manager of energy resource strategy and planning for Seattle City Light and an energy justice enthusiast.
I'm Conleigh Byers, an environmental fellow at Harvard Kennedy School of Government, researching grid decarbonization and electricity market design, and I'm also an energy justice enthusiast.
And to round out the quad factor, I don't know, what's the right term?
Farhad Billimoria from now on.
Yeah. Also an energy justice enthusiast, visiting research fellow at OIES and director at S&P.
Quad factor is better than quartet. Let's keep it.
Quartet.
Let's keep it. That's perfect. On Public Power Underground, we talk about the energy enthusiasm trifecta of electrification, markets, and people. On today's episode, we're discussing the building blocks of a just energy transition. Before we get to an interview with Professor Erin Baker, the faculty director of the Energy Transition Institute at UMass Amherst, we're starting with a favorite segment, 30 Seconds of Theory on energy justice tenets, and energy equity metrics. Conleigh, you are in Boston, and I know Amherst isn't in Boston, but I expect you to be able to pronounce it correctly. Is Amherst correct?
I think I read this in an article about underrepresented minorities at Amherst College and the debate of like people have to figure out how to say it and they don't know how to say it. And I think it was Amherst was the takeaway I was supposed to have from that. Hope that's right.
I hope so too. I
tended is silent.
I think
I tended to pronounce the H as like a Midwesterner, Amherst, but I think it's silent.
Hey, it's just endonym, exonyms, the Midwestern exonym. It's an Amherst.
It's an Amherst. Okay. I don't know exonyms and endonyms, and I didn't
it's
know
like
how to
saying
describe
Paris is an exonym, Paris is an endonym, like the thing that people from there call it, and the thing that people not from there in another language perhaps might call it. So, another one for the U.S. that comes up a lot is if you're from the Appalachian region, you probably say Appalachia. If you're from outside of it, you probably say Appalachia.
That is, I do say Appalachia. Now I understand the exogen.
Yeah. Well, if you go to West Virginia, people will get a little annoyed with you. You gotta Appalachia.
Okay. Note to self, Appalachia. Okay, well, first up on our 30 Seconds of Theory, Ahlmahz, I'm hoping you could start us out about what we're talking about when we talk about energy justice. Take it away.
All right, that is the $1 million question, Paul. What is energy justice? How do we define it? I have found that a lot of folks find the topic of energy justice a little bit abstract or esoteric, but it doesn't actually have to be that way. It's pretty simple. It really is just about ensuring that everyone can fairly benefit from the energy system, that they can participate in decision-making of the energy system, and they can do all of that without being disproportionately burdened. And that means disproportionately burdened with costs or any other harm from the energy system. So that's like pretty much the basic definition. Where people sometimes get a little confused is what that looks like in practice. Yeah, that sounds like a whole bunch of words, but what does that actually mean? So I like to tell folks, if you can take a deliberate action to ensure that the benefits and the burdens of our energy system are fairly distributed across society, then you basically have a grasp on what energy justice is. That's a big part of it. And going a little bit further, if you're able to recognize that the harms that the energy system has had on various communities in the past, and you take steps to create a future energy system that eliminates those harms, and not only eliminates them, but remediates some of those past harms, then you have a grasp on energy justice, because that at its core is what we're looking for in practice. So just to sort of wrap things up, at its core, energy justice is basically the planning and operation of our energy system with fair and just processes, which would lead to fair and just outcomes of our energy system. That's what we're hoping for.
What we're hoping for, that's what we're talking about. And we have a bunch more on that topic for this episode. The next 30 seconds of theory, though, I'm hoping to dig into some tenets of energy justice. Farhad, you're up next. 30 seconds. What are the 3 core tenets of energy justice?
So maybe since this is maybe the pre-ultimate episode, I just make one quick point there. I think I really liked what Ahlmahz just said. And it harkens me back to law school, where one day we had one of the chief justices of the High Court giving like a lecture, and someone asked him, what is justice? And it was actually a very, very sort of wide and open question, but he basically said that when it comes to making judgments and administering the law, you have the opportunity to just pull the trigger or pull the the handle and dole out whatever decision that the law says. But he said just giving a thought not only to what the law is, but what the law should be. And so maybe one thought here is to what, not just what the energy system is and the markets are, but what they should be. So there's my little rant on it. But I think in terms of the 3 tenets, a lot of the literature talks about 3 elements, one of which is distributional justice, which means that basically the way in which costs and benefits are shifted among society or distributed among society, either ab initio initially or through reallocations. Procedural justice is a second tenet, which is basically around who's involved in decision making and what rights and what making sure that there is a fair procedure that everyone is able to access. And then finally, recognition justice is understanding the disparities and having more than just a sort of representation, but actual recognition and a proper voice of all of the players and stakeholders in our energy system.
Conleigh, you're next. 30 seconds of theory. What are the 5 categories of energy justice metrics? And I'm going to caveat, according to Professor Baker's 2023 paper on metrics for decision-making and energy justice. There are probably more than 5 metrics, but she had some at least.
I was just going to say.
Yeah, so this is 5 categories then that we might think of metrics for energy justice in this paper. And the first one is tenets of equity and justice. So this is the categories that Farhad just mentioned: distributional, recognition, procedural. The second category is spatial and temporal. So thinking about how something might be different at a local level versus a global level, and that you need a metric that corresponds to that granularity, as well as temporal. So is this something that's going to have impacts in the near term or in the longer term? And to what degree are you thinking about historic wrongs as well? The third category is sectoral. So the energy system, of course, contains numerous sectors, including electricity, transportation, and industrial applications. So one category of metrics is figuring out in what sector are we talking about. The fourth is impacts on people. So the energy system can impact the well-being of people in a variety of ways, as Erin Baker says in this paper, both negative and positive. And those impacts can be financial, they could be physical, including air pollution, or they could be technical, such as access or supply of electricity. They could also be cultural or psychological as well. And the fifth category listed is life cycle. So importantly, when we're thinking about energy justice metrics, we don't just want to think about the use of energy at that time. We might think about the mining that was used to create some, create a source of energy, how it was transported, and then how it's disposed of, and what happens to the waste products.
Perfect. The 5 categories, well summarized. Thank you, Conleigh. My dog's barking in the background. This mic probably picks it up. Ahlmahz, anything you would add on our 30 seconds of theory about energy justice, and after Farhad and Conleigh's discussion of metrics and tenets and definitions?
I think that was nicely summarized. Nothing
Good. I would add on Farhad's point about justice and the question of like, what is justice? Y'all remember my terrible analogy at the beginning of this season about the energy system is as complicated as philosophy and ethics? Well, I quoted in that analogy, this work by Alistair McIntyre, A Short History of Ethics, he has subsequent works called After Virtue and Whose Justice, Which Rationality. What is right action is a deep and hairy question. We're going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsor and then an expansive conversation with Professor Erin Baker.
Energy Northwest is proud to provide clean, abundant, and reliable energy to help meet our growing needs. Energy Northwest is proudly advancing the Northwest's clean energy future.
I knew that.
Yeah, of course.
I knew that. They also have a great training program, which isn't in this promo, but I'll just provide it as a promo as well. They have a great internship program where college graduates can get an internship through Energy Northwest. I've talked about it many times on this podcast. I'm a big fan of that program. Wasn't in this ad read. They didn't write it in, but I'm just inserting it because I'm such a big fan.
All right. Well, sign up, boys and girls. Learn more about nuclear energy and its full potential at energy-northwest.com. That's energy-northwest.com.
I'm Paul Dockery.
And I'm Ahlmahz Negash.
Today, Ahlmahz and I are joined by Professor Erin Baker. Hello, Professor.
Hi there.
Are you excited? Do you have any idea what you're getting into?
Not really, but I'm excited. I'm excited to be with the two of you here.
And we were talking about this before we hit record, but we kind of each know you. You know each of us in some individual ways, and then now you get to have the wonderful experience of Ahlmahz and I together.
Right. I didn't know the two of you knew each other.
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do. I'm very, very proud to be associated with Ahlmahz. So Professor Erin Baker is a distinguished professor of mechanical and industrial engineering and faculty director of the Energy Transition Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the College of Engineering. UMass Amherst, is that what we refer to it as?
Yeah, UMass Amherst, that's right.
UMass Amherst. Professor Baker applies operations research and economics to decision-making under uncertainty with a focus on energy justice and publicly funded energy technology research and development portfolios in the face of climate change. Anything else you'd want to add?
That sounds about right. I'm just excited to be here and talk about energy justice.
Yes, us too.
Yes, indeed. So No, I don't have anything else to add. I'm happy to have you here, Erin. Should we just jump on into it?
Yeah, maybe an additional point of context. We're here at the office, PNUCC, Pacific Northwest Utilities Conference Committees. They reserved this room for us. Thank you, friend of the Underground Crystal Ball.
So nice of Crystal.
And we get to do this in person, so it feels a little bit more natural, and we get to read body language. So when we're ready to go to the next one, let's go to it, Ahlmahz.
All right. So, Erin, in a 2023 article titled "Metrics for Decision Making in Energy Justice," there's a quote that says, "It is necessary to have appropriately designed metrics to identify vulnerable populations, design and analyze possible policy, technology, and business solutions, and monitor and evaluate the outcomes of such efforts," end quote. In the paper, one specific area highlighted is the need for wealth creation, ownership, and autonomy metrics. And it really reminded me of a previous podcast episode where Paul and I had a conversation with Lorenzo Christov, and an area of particular interest to the public power institution. So can you talk a little bit more about why wealth creation, ownership, and autonomy are important considerations for a just energy transition?
That's right. Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, as many people know listening to this podcast, the energy transition is going to be a massive change, truly massive, which presents challenges, but it also brings opportunities. And I like to kind of focus on the opportunities. So we do want to do no harm, right? We want to measure things so we don't make things worse. But we would also like to kind of take advantage of this energy transition to make the world a better place. And that is where thinking about things like wealth creation is really important. I think something to keep in mind when we have such a massive change, there simply is no one path to get there. There's a whole bunch of paths. And so we need to kind of steer ourselves to a path where we can make things better. And so we want to go, so when we think of equity and justice, people often think about the distribution of good things and bad things, who's getting good things, who's getting bad things. And that is very, very important. But I think we want to go beyond that and think about wealth, because the energy transition is going to create wealth. And so can we kind of harness this so that the wealth is created in communities that have been cut out in the past?
I like the way you're thinking. So you're saying it's a way of thinking about the transition is not just a reallocation of what is existing, but an actual making of the bigger of that wealth pie.
Right. I definitely see that.
Okay.
Again, that comes somewhat from my background of thinking about technology and technological change. The energy transition is not just about technology, for sure, but it's going to inspire technological change. And anytime you do that, you're actually creating entirely new pockets of wealth.
So can you, if this is a good time to jump in, give us a little bit of some context. So utility folks really love examples. So when we talk about wealth creation, what kind of metrics are examples of wealth creation?
Yeah, so I can give you some examples. I do want to back up a little bit and say you should think of these as kind of straw man examples, right? These are things I'm throwing out there. And the reason is that we talked about wealth creation, but the other piece of that is autonomy and is putting kind of power in the hands, so electric power, but also kind of political power in the hands of marginalized communities. And so autonomy means that it doesn't really make sense for me to sit here and come up with these metrics, right? We really want to go and talk to these marginalized communities and say, are we measuring the right thing? Is this something that's important to you? But we have to start somewhere, right? Yep. So I will throw out some examples that we came up with. So one is ownership and how ownership of different resources relates to different demographics like wealth, income, and race. And so an obvious one, and where people have done a little bit of work, not me personally, is on like solar. Like who has rooftop solar, who owns it, who leases it, that kind of thing. But we can look more broadly, there's a lot of resources to be owned. And so ownership of resources.
Can I follow up on that before you go to the next example? So we both work for public power. So I work for a municipal utility and you're a public utility. Yeah, is it a municipal?
It's a municipal.
There we go.
Tacoma,
Two municipal utility. So we both own, both of our utilities own hydro projects. Do you consider that public own? Like, how does that go with the ownership perspective? Is that an ownership model where it's like all of our customers have a partial ownership of it? How do you think about those examples?
Yeah, that's a great example. I mean, I guess what I would probably look at in the municipal utility. So the municipal utility owns it. And so, it is kind of owned by the people in the community. But there, I think where you'd really want to look would be the representation on the boards. Okay. So who's actually making the decision? So yes, everybody might own it in some sense, but not really if they're not represented on the board. They're not making the decisions about it. And so then in some ways, I wouldn't count that in the same way that I count, like if you actually have rooftop solar on your house, or if you're part of a co-op who, that owns a small generation, then that's a little bit different.
And so that gets to your distinction earlier between not just wealth creation, but also autonomy. So that's the representation on the board gets you to the autonomy of your decisions about that. So keep going on the examples. Thanks.
Yeah, so there's different, again, percentage of ownership by local community members when you actually look at that. But what I think is interesting, what I wanted to bring up is there's IEJ, do you know where that stands for?
Institute for Energy Justice?
Yeah, sorry, Institute for Energy Justice, IEJ 100. They have a whole bunch of good suggestions, and especially for autonomy. And so this is a very much of a grassroots effort. So these ones are actually more that came from the grassroots. We mentioned in our paper, they're not really in the literature, the academic literature right now, but they're there. So their examples is what I just said: representation on advisory and decision-making bodies, community engagement. So something like the percentage of actions that have prior consent from, say, an indigenous community or a certain community. And then another one is funding for participation of marginalized communities in this decision-making process. I think that one's really interesting. Yeah. So, do these municipalities, because many people in marginalized communities, they can't afford to come to meetings if there's no childcare for their children, or if the meetings are at a time. That's what I find, in Amherst, the meetings are all on weekday evenings, because that's very convenient for all the soccer moms and dads, right, who have to go to travel soccer on the weekend. But it's not necessarily a convenient time for people who work 2 jobs, or whatever. So that's...
I was super excited. So the state of Washington actually passed law a couple years ago allowing at least the state to provide compensation for community members to participate in state public stakeholder meetings. And so the city of Tacoma also developed one as well, so we can pay. But I'll add what's important. A lot of times, even though that law is passed and the opportunity there, a lot of times people don't even know that it exists. So it's not just having the funding, but actually letting people know that it's available for them as well is really important.
Yeah. And this timing of meetings, that's something I'm interested in.
Of course,
I know that one group, I forget who the group was, who were trying to reach out to kind of fairly marginalized communities. They asked them, when should we meet? And they're like, I think it was Sunday mornings at the laundromat. Like, that's really convenient for us.
Literally the last place the utility would have thought first, right?
Yeah, right.
I mean, that's not that's not where people hold meetings.
Yeah.
And yet that impressed me a lot. I'm like, so if we actually want if we want to hear what people have to say, we need to do that, even though that may not be convenient for some of the people holding the meeting, right? And also they might not have thought of it. So it does help that you actually ask people what's convenient for you. So it's funding is important, and then that's also a metric because you can look and see. So you might have you have the law, you have the funding. How much funding did you actually spend in this last year on people in communities? And again, what are the demographics of the people who got the funding to see if are you really getting to the communities you want? So those are some examples.
I love it.
I want to rewind a little bit because you started out about how there are different pathways. Like we have a bunch of options about how to solve this problem and the different ways we can solve it. And you mentioned that part of what we want to do is like form the pathway based on what we intend to do in success. And in your bio, like you come from operations research and industrial engineering. Can you talk about the link there between like decisions under uncertainty, how you got into this in some ways about the different pathways?
Yeah, well, I can just talk a little bit about this. So one of the reasons I said that is that a lot of people do take a kind of narrow optimization view where they always want to talk about the trade-offs. Okay. And they're like, oh, yes, but if we're going to make it more equitable, how much more is it going to cost or how much low is the reliability, right? That's a very classic thing.
Right.
And I just think it's a little bit mistaken, and it's very much an operations research kind of perspective. And it's true.
Very much an engineer's perspective too, right?
I mean, and it is true. If you have a single objective, you will go towards that objective and not care about anything else. But I think as you get kind of more sophisticated in operations research, is you kind of think about, well, what do we really care about? And in the long run, that's where the technological change stuff I've done shows up. That like sometimes the least cost thing today is not the least cost thing over time, right? It doesn't get you to the dynamics. And so I think this is very similar, that we need to be looking at the big picture and doing things that get us the place where we want to go. And I actually don't think in the long run it's going to cost us any more money. I think that it's possible it'll even cost less because we have the whole community participating, right? The more people who are participating, the more people who are coming up with suggestions for solutions, the more likely we're going to end up in a better place. So I don't know if that was exactly what you wanted, but
that is exactly what I want. Thank you very much.
And as you were talking, I was just hearing some parallels between the way we think about and frame energy justice now needs to kind of go the same path as the way we talk about carbon. So because we externalize those costs. The cheaper cost can sometimes not be the clean solution, but as soon as we start to internalize the costs of carbon, then these renewables might be more cost effective, for example. Right. And when I hear people talk about the trade-off between the least cost solution and the just solution, it's because we haven't actually put a value on a just transition. And I would love to, we either put justice as the objective or we have to somehow, the same way we had put a cost on carbon, put a cost on inequity in our systems as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think again, there's different ways to get there. And I think part of it is just is envisioning it and really thinking about where's the world? What's the world that we want to live in? And I think once you start thinking about that, then you all of a sudden, it suddenly opens up paths that you didn't see before.
Exciting.
Yeah.
It is very exciting. Have you read the solar punk genre yet? Are you into that literary space yet, or any interest?
No, cyberpunk a long time ago, but I haven't heard about solar punk yet.
Yeah, there's this series. It's the Monk and Robot series. I forget the author's name off the top of my head, but it is this. I'm a science fiction and fantasy. Like that's my genre. I like that. But they do envision like what a energy plethora future is like, and it's the exploration of what do you actually want your society to be arranged in after we're successful, and hopefully we are successful.
Yeah, I think that getting back to the operations research, I think that so again, we optimize an objective, and then we have constraints that kind of tell us where we need to stay in. But I think what happens in real life is we have a bunch of constraints that we're not thinking through at all, right?
Right.
They're just there because it's like the way, a classic constraint, right? It's just the way we've always done it before. And that's not really a real constraint, right? That doesn't need to be there. And in fact, you might be much better off if you can let go of those constraints. So I think that's another, from my very nerdy OR perspective, it's that, we have these constraints that aren't really constraints.
So Erin, I don't want to, if you want to think about it, you can think about it, but I'm going to ask you, because you were talking about envisioning. If you were to envision what a just energy future looks like, what does it look like to you? You can hold that off till the very end, or if you have that answer right now, go ahead and I'd love to hear your vision.
Yeah, so that's, for me, I'm trying to think, I'm not that I have a particular vision. I have things that I think would be true. And what I think would be true is that these kind of marginalized communities, people who really have not had a voice, will be coming to the table and will come up with ideas that'll bring us into places that I can't envision. That's what I feel like. I feel like I'm kind of limited, right? I've got my own little, fairly privileged, academic perspective. And I guess my vision for the future is that we won't be limited to that.
I love it.
So in the 3 tenets of energy justice, one of them is procedural. And when you say that, I think a lot about the procedural, like the participating and helping have autonomy in the future. Is that the element that it's all of the elements, but is that what you're speaking to there, or am I missing something about the necessary components to invite people in and get them to participate in the decisions?
Yeah, I think so. That's right. You're not going to get real justice until people are participating. And that is, I think, the procedural justice part of things. That you might get various distributional changes that might be good, but if people aren't involved, then it's not real justice. And I guess the idea is likely you feel like things will then kind of drift off in the wrong direction again. Whereas once you get everybody involved, it's more likely that justice will stay as what we're aiming for.
And as public power utilities here in a public power podcast, to not let it go by cheaply and just say, hey, we're public power, we have a public democratically elected board. It's more than that. It's about representation and participation in that process by the marginalized communities is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, especially, I think we have to keep structural inequalities in mind. And so a publicly elected board may or may not be fully representative for a number of different reasons.
Okay. Well, we're going to talk more about metrics, and you had one example of metrics around ownership and autonomy and ownership of the infrastructure. But Ahlmahz, you shared with us recently, both Erin and I, an advanced copy of an article on metrics you co-authored with some colleagues from Pacific Northwest National Labs and the National Renewable Energy Laboratory.
That's right.
First, you've heard me on this podcast throughout the season advocate for me doing the recordings of papers like this and then publishing them. And I wanted to know whether we get to do that for this one, if I get to record it and
absolutely,
then release it. Okay, perfect.
No question about it.
Feel privileged and honored. So seriously, the paper addresses this dilemma about moving urgently to address climate change and respond to energy disruptions, but also slowly to engage communities intentionally so that you can make sure you're addressing those communities that are on the front lines in earnest. Can you talk about the paper and how you think about those metrics, grappling with the with the dilemma?
Yeah, so I don't know that there's necessarily any metric that's going to do away with that dilemma. It kind of is what it is, right? But a couple of things that I'll say, and then I'll give an example of how Tacoma Power has sort of met with this issue very recently. So it's true. You want to involve the communities, but you also want to act urgently and progress and not be stalled. You might have heard the phrase that nothing moves faster than the speed of trust, or something like that.
Yep.
And that's been my experience, that when you can build trust, that you can move things a little bit more quickly than if you don't establish those relationships with community members. Now, when it comes to measuring that, so a metric that can measure trust. So I'm going to build a little bit on some of the metrics that you talked about, the ones that you mentioned. Great examples were more quantitative type metrics. And to be honest, the utility folks lean into those a bit more. We understand them. They're easy for us and our analytical and technical folks to understand. But some things are a lot less tangible, things like trust. You can do your surveys and, some qualitative metrics. But that's, you do have to make a shift towards more qualitative metrics to get at some of those things that help that, with that grappling of the dilemma between moving fast and then also including communities. Trust really does take you a long way. And I'll give an example. So our IRP I've been at Tacoma for 8 years now. Every IRP, well, for the most part, and the first half of my career at Tacoma, no resource need. We've included in our stakeholder process tribes. That they're an important part of our stakeholders engagement. But we included the folks that are part of our service area because, we weren't really looking at anything at our projects. But more recently, we started thinking about what it might look like to make some changes at our projects, doing things like that. And so it would impact tribes that are at our sites, not at all within the service area. And so I call up and meet. So by the way, I was on sabbatical last year. I think we met when I was on sabbatical, right? And so I came into the IRP process after it had already been started, and I was really eager to get. When I saw that we wanted to include that, I was like, let's get our tribes at the sites involved. Reached out to our generation folks, and I'm like, yeah, we got to hurry up and get these people involved in our process. The IRP is going to be wrapping up in a few months, and he was just like, whoa. No, that's not what you do. Like, you don't come in just before a process is almost done and then invite people because it feels disingenuous. Feels like, your stuff is already baked. He's like, nope, you develop those relationships first, and then you bring them to the table and have an honest stakeholder engagement. And so that, there were things that we left off of our modeling because we hadn't put in enough time to engage our communities. And so, yes. In this particular case, because we hadn't done, if we had, back when I first started, been establishing those relationships, even though we didn't actually have any intention of looking at anything at the projects, we would have been in place right when we needed to have those discussions. But we paused. We actually paused to do things the right way, and I think that's just the way it's going to be. Trust is what we're going for, and whatever qualitative way you can measure that is going to be key moving forward.
Can you talk a little bit more about in the relationship? So there's one thing about projects, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's understanding and getting that stakeholder input. So in this instance, you weren't able to engage with them because it was too late in the process. Mm-hmm. But you have, you and I've talked before, you have some relationships with communities in Tacoma where you have had some time to build those relationships. Can you talk about what's successful in engaging with them and how to actually tease out these complicated input to a complicated technical solution?
We actually have, when it comes to folks in our service area, we have a community liaison staff that actually goes out and attends community meetings. His whole job is to establish and develop relationships in the community. So when it's time for our IRP process, we go to him and we're like, we'd like to invite some folks into this process. And we'll either, they'll either come to our meetings or we'll offer to go where the community is at. More recently, we actually had the Mayor's Youth Commission participate. So we've never had youth participate. Well, I'll take that back. We've had some college students that participated, but this time we had high school students that were on the Mayor's Youth Commission that actually participated. But yes, we had to go to a Saturday event because kids go to school. But yeah, so that was one that I thought was incredibly successful. The kids were engaged, they were smart, they had their opinions, and we were happy to have them participate in that process.
And Erin, when you were talking about metrics earlier and about the need to engage with communities on the right metrics, can you talk about, like, the way I think about it is in a lot of ways as technical experts, we have to be translators, or the community moderator folks have to be translators for technical topics to lay audience. Do I have that right or wrong? Or how do you think about the development in collaboration with community?
I mean, I'm not really sure. It's it's complicated. I know. So we have a project right now that I think is really interesting in Holyoke, Massachusetts. It's really, the purpose of this is maybe slightly different. It's to develop community-based participatory research around energy solutions. So we're actually trying to build up people in the community who can actually help us do research. Oh. And so it's very cool. And so it's really interesting that, the kind of translator, or like, oh, hi, we're the people who know all the technology. We're going to explain it to you. I don't know. It's like you can be very careful about that, right? So this Krista Harper who runs this, she's a culture anthropologist, and she's amazing and very creative. And so what she did is she started something called the Energy Justice Leader. So we recruited about 20 or 30 people from all across Holyoke, but mostly from kind of marginalized communities, half Spanish speaking, half English speaking. So that's been very interesting. Everything, like all of our materials are all in 2 languages. And she's actually developing a toolkit for this, for how to do this with energy, because I guess you must find the same thing, Ahlmahz. Energy is a fairly abstract concept. And so a lot of people don't walk into the room with very many thoughts about energy. I mean, they maybe have thoughts about their bills or something like that, but they don't have a lot of, they don't have a lot to say. So we've been trying to develop these activities, which are really, really fun. So we did one called participatory mapping, where we had all these maps of Holyoke. And so we would ask people, first we'd start with, some things like, I'm trying to think, it was like, well, where do you go when it's really hot out and you want to stay cool? And so various questions like that kind of got people involved in that. And then they got really excited to, because some people knew a lot about where things were and other people didn't know where anything was. Then we brought in some of the energy infrastructure, and they're less familiar with that, except for in Holyoke, they're very proud of their dams. And so they kind of knew where the dams were, but they didn't know where a lot of that stuff was, which is also interesting, right? Because, we often think everybody knows what this is, and they don't know. So that was fun. Or another one that's her specialty called Photo Voice, where we'd ask a question like what's your cozy place? Or I forget what the other questions were, but, because the idea being your cozy place is someplace where you're either cool in the summer or warm in the winter. And then they take a picture of it and they write some words on it. And then as a community, we all would talk about what they took a picture of, and we would see what people thought of anyway. So we have these kind of toolkits for developing a conversation. And so we will provide some, so we're going to do something on demand response. So, we have to explain what demand response is. So we're doing that right now. I'm very excited.
Do you call it demand response?
I'm not even sure if we've really thought about the words we're going to use yet, but that's what we call demand response.
I'm totally going off of here,
but no, that's fine.
I've heard that it's the people don't respond to it well because it's you're demanding that I respond to you. So it just, so anyway, the phrase, you got to come up with a different word. I know, that's why I was curious if you're using that.
Part of it is this is really a very initial thing. And so partly we want to see how people respond. Mm-hmm. We're interested to see, do people think things are unfair? Are they concerned about trust, or other things? I mean, we actually found we did early on, we had a thing where we had a bunch of posters with a whole bunch of different things. And we had demand response on there somehow. And we got a lot of people interested in it. Some of it, I might have mentioned before, some of it is that people they think, so it's interesting. Apparently, it's very intuitive that electricity is more expensive in times when everybody uses it and less expensive when it's not. Because they all thought they had time of use pricing. And they wanted technologies which would help them reduce their cost of electricity by reducing their demand during high demand times. So it was kind of interesting. They don't, in fact. They're at a municipal utility and they have a flat electricity cost. But I found that really interesting so actually it's not very a hard concept. I mean, they just assumed that electricity was expensive in the times when everyone used it, even though it's not.
That's interesting. I've never heard something like that before.
Yeah,
I think I've run across the same dynamic too, where people are really, it's intuitive that it's going to be more expensive if I do this like in the hottest day, even if they don't have the pricing mechanisms.
They were hoping for like appliances that would respond automatically to the prices or something. So anyway, we'll see when we introduce it what we get. So we're going to try to,
Cool.
So I guess my point is we're going to try to explain it with a little talk up ahead, but then we're going to we have these really cool things called Pico boards. So we're going to actually kind of demonstrate it. So we're going to have like everybody turn on all of their appliances and then we're like, the nuclear power plant's going offline. And then everything goes out. Because again, I think everybody here knows this, right? But a lot of people have no idea that if supply doesn't meet demand, they just assume like one light bulb will go out, right? Like there's not enough for all the light bulbs, that light bulb's going to go out, but we know it won't. But I think that can be interesting for people.
So is the toolkit on how to engage community in these topics, or are they going to drive towards input and metrics for the community?
I think the toolkit we're building right now is really on how to engage the community on the topics of energy, how to get people interested in energy and talking about it in a way that's meaningful to them and that's meaningful to us. So I think that's what her particular thing that she's working on. So then I'm interested in metrics. So kind of taking this next step and saying from people, like, so then what should your utility be measuring? What would you most like them to measure? But I think it takes a while to get to the point where that's even a sensible question. Yeah. That's because my tendency is to run in and be like, okay, what do you want us to measure? But Chris is like, we need to, we need to build trust. We need to, get people talking. We need to get people in a place where they feel comfortable. So many people in our energy justice don't have a ton of formal education. And so they can very easily feel intimidated if anything about it feels like a test or a class or something like that. So we don't want it to feel like this is a classroom and we're asking questions and you raise your hand, like nothing like that. It has to be really, but once you get everybody on a table and they're all working together, they get very excited. And then we learn a lot about what they know and also what's happening in the community.
It sounds like a fascinating. So, and you're developing, I think you called it an energy justice league, is kind of the way you're framing
leaders. Yeah. So she's recruited. I think every year she's going to recruit a new group of, I think it's 20 or 30 energy justice leaders, and then the hope is that they will then, be disseminating what they're learning and understanding, and they'll continue to be energy justice leaders. And then, so next year we'll have a new group, and so by the time we're done with this 5-year grant, we'll have whatever that is, 100 or more energy justice leaders in the community.
Yeah, I'm just gonna, something you said earlier about certain communities not always having education, and I'm gonna push back on that a little bit and just say one other thing, that even being educated doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna be, like that energy will be intuitive. So you'll have commissioners, you'll have council members, you'll have tons of people in positions of power that don't understand how energy works. And so that engagement has to, I believe it has to go it has to be regardless of your education level.
Right. Totally agree with that.
Yeah.
That point was actually more with the way we just want to be really careful. Because again, we're academics, so we have a tendency to be like, well, let's ask a question and then they'll all have the wrong answer and then we'll show them what the right answer, because that's the way you sometimes do in academia. But in this group, they would all just be like, they would feel like we were telling them that they were stupid, which is not what we think. So it was more the approach and not so much that.
Okay.
Because I think in general, energy is a very abstract concept. And I think there's a lot of, ways that people don't understand it. And then there's ways we don't understand that people interact with energy as well. So no, I do agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to pivot a little bit because we've talked a lot about metrics and about community engagement. We'll have a link to the Holyoke project in the show notes for people to go find the toolkit when it's ready to be replicated in other communities. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about like unintended consequences of some of the climate actions we can take, because as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of pathways we can take. One of them is around carbon capture and sequestration. There are uses of like biomass projects that may end up being climate projects, but have some local concerns because of the way they work. There was a recent pause on EPA's Good Neighbor rule, also around these local effects of emissions. Can you talk about outcomes from climate policies and how sometimes they can exacerbate climate injustices?
Yeah, so I mean, carbon capture is a pretty obvious one, but it is interesting. So we were just curious as what happens with carbon, what happens to local pollution, co-pollution, so NOx and SOx and PM, if you have carbon capture. And so we have a fairly simple model, but in our simple model, we were quite interested to find that if carbon capture is an option, that we got more local pollution as climate policy got more stringent. And so, the higher the carbon tax or the more stringent, the more local pollution in these communities. So we thought that was kind of interesting. So part of it is from carbon capture has an energy penalty. So that's that it simply takes energy to run carbon capture. So all else being equal, if you're going to sell or whatever, get to the communities the same amount of energy, you're going to have to generate more energy in order to do that, and so you get more pollution. But we also that's kind of a basic thing.
Right.
So that's always going to happen. But it was worse than that. It was worse than that. That what we found is that you tended to get generation moving from gas power plants to coal power plants, because coal is much more CO2 intensive, and so it's almost all CO2 kind of coming out of the stack. So capturing it's much more cost effective to put a carbon capture plant on a coal plant than a gas plant. And so we saw in, like, if you had a certain amount of wind power, enough wind power, you would only put the carbon capture on the coal plant, and then you would run it more than you ran it before. So we found that interesting, surprising, kind of a little bit of a bummer. But yeah, so that was that. So then we looked specifically at some of there's a bunch of rules on carbon capture. So EPA has what are called the new standards for greenhouse gas emissions that would, to put it simple, would require carbon capture on fossil plants if they continue. So that one's not quite as bad, but it still can lead to more pollution because of this energy penalty issue. It doesn't lead so much to because everybody gets carbon capture, and so you don't move generation from gas to coal necessarily. We didn't see as much of that, but we saw energy penalty. Then, which people might be familiar with, there's the 45Q tax credit for storing CO2. So that's where if you generate electricity and you store CO2, you get a tax credit for every ton that you store. That tax credit is very, very high. And so what it means is that it's actually more than the marginal cost of generating electricity from coal. And so even if you have wind energy and solar, which the marginal cost is zero, you're going to burn coal. So you're being paid to burn coal just because. So of course that leads to way more local pollution, because now you're just throwing away your wind and solar, which had no cost. It's already built. It's got no cost to you. So these are some very, I don't know, are they unintended? Who designed 45Q? But it's a somewhat unintended, I think, surprising and certainly disappointing outcomes.
Ahlmahz, you and I've talked about unintended and Cobra effect. Can you talk a little bit more about the way you think about these types of things?
That is such a, whenever I talk about unintended consequences, or the fear that I have of unintended consequences in our energy justice policies, it's the Cobra effect. And you've just given several examples of the Cobra effect, but it's an anecdote that gets its name from colonial times in India. The British thought that there were too many cobras, and they decided to have this policy where you kill a cobra, you bring it in, you get an incentive payment. And so it worked pretty well. People were going out, killing the cobras, bringing them in, getting their incentive payments. And then eventually some enterprising people realized that if I breed cobras, then I can make even more money. And so this policy that was intended to reduce the population actually ended up increasing the population, because once the authorities found out about it, they ended the program, and then all the breeders just let the snakes go. And so like it was totally counterproductive. But that often happens whenever there is an incentive, right? People are sneaky, greedy, smart. I don't know what the right adjective is, but if there's money.
Enterprising.
Okay, let's call it that, right? You put an incentive out there, people are going to go for it. So whenever we have these policies, it's just really important to be really thoughtful and say, what are we incentivizing? You might have a goal, and instead of being, taking a linear path to getting to that goal, you think, a linear solution. We have to move to more systems thinking and systems approaches to solutions, understanding if I do this, what are the second, third, fourth order impacts that might occur as a result of this. And until we get to that, we're going to always have these unintended consequences. And I don't know if we are saying unintended in quotes, but for sure the cobras were certainly unintended, right? And I really worry about especially our energy justice policies, because these are vulnerable populations that we're talking about. And so if we have an incentive that somehow manages to exploit or exacerbate the situations of vulnerable people because there's an incentive out there, I worry about that quite a bit.
Yeah, I think you can never, obviously they're unintended. And so you can never kind of keep those from happening entirely. But I do think there are some kind of good practices. I mean, one is always to really carefully think, what could go wrong? And again, be imaginative about it. So that's where one of the things we do at UMass is we have a very, very interdisciplinary group of people working on energy justice. And so, for instance, we have, I'm always so proud because we have this one PhD student who's in comparative literature.
That's
and people
great.
don't think of comparative literature as studying this. But the reason you need people like that is exactly for what could go wrong, right? Because then you need like your science fiction. You need to kind of think, you need stories. It's storylines are much better at telling you where things could go wrong than just like, optimization, you solve your math model and you're like, so I think so one way to help this is to get people who are storytellers and used to kind of thinking creatively and not just mathematically to try to see if they can predict some ways it could go wrong.
I absolutely love that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad we got there. I think you and I have had this conversation before about the value of social sciences, the value of like arts and letters, the value of people outside the engineering and economics disciplines in our utility space because of the creativity, the approaching of problems differently.
Yeah. It's
really, really valuable. So I'm glad we got there.
Yeah, and it's great. It is, though, at the same time, it's challenging. It's really challenging because when you first start, it's like it's like you're talking in different directions, you know, like when you say something and they respond, they're like, oh, yes, this. And you're just like, what? So it's very hard to make sense of what people are saying at first. So again, it's this whole like building trust though, right? Whether it's even the people you work with or it's these other communities, it takes time to build up this trust.
Yep, absolutely. It does. It will take time, but we need to invest the time, even if it is going to take more time.
Absolutely. Do you have any advice for energy justice enthusiasts like Paul and I and you, or other policymakers, practitioners, planners, and just straight up energy nerds that may stumble upon this recording?
Right.
Words of wisdom.
Yeah, so I think my main words of wisdom are that we need to be very intentional. That again, we have this incredible structural injustices that many of us who work in this field are fairly privileged and may have a lot of implicit bias, class bias and race bias. So we have to be very, very intentional, back up, kind of look at data. And then again, you have to listen to the communities. And the example I want to give there is you have to listen to communities with this kind of really open mind and a creative mind, a lot like you would like your doctor to listen to you. You know how when you go to the doctor and you're always like, oh, this or that, and they're like, yeah. Or sometimes they're just like, yeah, and they just give you the standard thing and they don't really listen. And then 6 months later, you're like, I told them that. So I feel like that's what we need to be doing. We need to listen to communities because what you first hear, sometimes it doesn't seem quite on topic, I'd say. But you have to listen more carefully. And, so like we find when we start talking about energy, everybody wants to talk about mold in their house. They think about their housing quality and mold problems. And so there's a tendency to be like, okay, well, we're a public utility. We can't deal with the mold in your house, right? But so what you need to do though is you need to really keep that in mind. And whenever you're thinking of anything, you're like, okay, is this going to make the mold problem worse? Is there a way this could make the mold problem better? What is the interaction? So anyway, that's just one example. But that's what I would say is be intentional and really listen with an open mind.
I love that. You talked about mold. I gotta brag about a program that Tacoma Power has. I was not involved in it. This was other people's work, but I was so proud of it. So a while back, we wanted to look at our conservation programs to see if they were equitable. And so we have an equity index that sort of looks at all of the different census block groups, and we have a metric that looks at the opportunity in each of those. And so it can be very low opportunity all the way up to very high opportunity. Anyway, so we sort of overlaid that map on top of the map of all of the conservation programs we've ever had. And lo and behold, they were equitable. So if we had like 15% of our population that were in the very low income groups, then they were, very low opportunity index areas, then we had about 15% of our programs that were in that area as well. So it was very equitable in that sense geographically, but we found out that, and this is not surprising, we were not serving our renters equitably. We required all of our participants in our programs to be homeowners. So renters were paying into a program that they could never benefit from. And so what they did, the conservation group developed a program that provided landlords with a forgivable loan if they agreed to keep their rent affordable for at least 5 years, not going up 6% a year. So in trying to solve an energy justice issue, they actually helped solve a housing affordability problem. Wow. So maybe there's that way to fix the mold. Right. And just thinking outside the box and being creative. I love the idea of listening and finding some way to solve. I don't want to say kill two birds with one stone, but solve two problems with one solution. Let's call it that.
Yep.
Great.
Ahlmahz and I had a conversation after an interview we did with Ari Pesco, and one of the things Farhad asked both of us was what is public power good at? Are they good at innovating? And my point was kind of along your theme there, that we're really good when we engage on these problems that can help our customers reduce their costs.
Yes.
And that is, I believe, a skill of public power. I actually, while I totally agree on the autonomy and the need to have representation on our governing boards, I do think our business model does help with the wealth creation within our communities. So to bring us back to the beginning, I hope this was a fun conversation for you, and I hope you feel seen, heard, valued, and appreciated, Erin.
Definitely. Yes, it's been great.
Anything you'd want to add on areas we missed or to emphasize?
I think that's it, but I kind of copy what you just said, that I think we want to work towards a world where all consumers in all communities are seen and heard and valued and appreciated.
Yes. I love it.
Thank you.
Nailed it. I got a ding. Ding. Nailed it. Now back to Conleigh and Farhad for some more energy enthusiasm. We're back with Ahlmahz, Conleigh, and Farhad. I'm going to start with you, Conleigh. What stuck out to you in the conversation with Professor Baker?
Something that stuck out to me was certainly thinking about how changing one element in a system can have very counterintuitive effects. So say the example brought up of the tax credit for carbon capture and sequestration, but the level of that credit meant that it was, became more economical to produce coal. And, in the counterfactual, less coal would have been produced, but with that credit, more coal is produced. But even if the carbon were captured, there would be more local co-pollutants that were not CO2 that weren't captured. So that is something that really echoes through all of the conversations we've had this season. When you're thinking about the power grid or the electricity system, it's really important to think about what is your counterfactual if you change something, that those effects can be really broad reaching and might not always be as intuitive.
That's a good point. That's something that I worry about a lot, actually, especially because of who the primary subjects for energy justice topics tend to be communities that have been marginalized or overburdened historically already. And so if we come up with incentives or policies, energy justice, well-intended, that actually have the opposite intended impact that we were going for. This is not the community. These aren't the communities you really want to be having unintended consequences on. So I think about that a lot. Yeah, that stood out to me as well, Conleigh.
I think that's a really important point, and I guess one of the hard questions when it comes to actually, we're kind of debating it here, but when people actually make decisions on it and making policies, it is inevitable that there will be impacts everywhere. And so I guess one of my questions and to folks who are thinkers and policymakers in this space is, how do you actually reconcile that? Every action will have winners and losers, and sometimes the losses may be quite significant for the folks that feel them, but in the broader context of the overall decision, maybe it's a small cost component, but that's still really important for those folks, right? So how, like, as we think about now this whole thing around developing infrastructure and large scale energy generation and wind farms, solar, they're all affecting communities. Even retirement of coal, they're all affecting communities. So one question I think is, how do we do that in a way where some of this kind of needs to be done, right, for decarbonization, but how do you do that in a way that gets the support of those communities, but also mitigates any issues, any costs and impacts that they feel?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. What I was thinking about in regards to this is that when we think about wanting to have distributional justice and procedural justice, I think sometimes that can sound like what we want is local decision-making authority. And we might want that sometimes, but I think we have to be a bit cautious, because when we're talking about wanting to build lots of new projects, lots of new infrastructure, it does have to get built somewhere. And as Farhad said, there probably will be winners and losers. And while it is really important that every potentially affected community has a seat at the table in that decision-making process, making all those decisions at the local level could end up having a worse outcome. So for instance, I think about the housing market, right? And where we have in the United States or in Canada as well, very local authority to decide zoning and what gets built where. And we have a big housing crisis because we're simply not building enough housing. And, NIMBYism is a big part of that. And so when you have a lot of that decision-making authority at the local level, it doesn't necessarily lead to a good decision. So, at a regional level, we might say, well, we really want to solve the housing crisis, build more housing, but I don't want it to be built where I am. And even if you're talking about a marginalized community, they might also feel that way, because they may reasonably expect that if more housing is built where they are, it could lead to rents rising just because of more urban renewal, more things happening here, the character of that neighborhood changing. And, ultimately, we still want to build more housing, but there are winners and losers in that process. And so where that decision-making authority lies matters a lot to how far we get to accomplish that goal. So same analog for building out energy infrastructure. Sometimes some of the examples we covered with Erin Baker's interview, like, community solar, okay, that might be something that a lot of us can get behind. But when we're talking about where do we build these new high voltage transmission lines and, things that really will have a negative impact somewhere, and figuring out, how do we do that in the most just and reasonable way? But it may not be local decision-making authority so much.
One of the questions I wanted to get into with Professor Baker that we did was actually on this topic, and the linking between the conversation with Lynn Kiesling and this procedural justice question. Because when we talked with Lynn about common pool resources, we brought up the work by Eleanor Ostroms around the management and governance of common pool resources and the laying of jurisdiction. Is that kind of what we're getting into here? Is in some ways you need to make sure for this common pool resource, it is a regional infrastructure that provides economic value to larger footprints than have the direct impact of the local infrastructure, that you need a governance structure that reflects the competing interests of those group and bridges it. Is that where you're going,
Yeah.
Conleigh?
I think that's definitely a fair way to sum that up, especially when we're thinking about debates over how and where to build new transmission and who pays for it. I think what we're discovering from those conversations is it's really hard to get people to agree. But that kind of interregional collaboration and not allowing too much local or, smaller regional veto power is really important to getting that common goal achieved.
Oh gosh, I'm struggling with this Conley. So I recognize the importance of regional decision making, and sometimes a decision isn't if a decision impacts a broad region, then there isn't like one person, one area within that region that should be able to have total veto power. That much I can sort of get on board with that. But I'm still struggling with the idea that it has to be built somewhere, and so we like somebody's just going to have to deal with it kind of mindset, because I feel like that's at the end of the day, so long as we have a society with marginalized communities, those are going to be the ones that end up getting feeling the brunt of that type of a decision making. So I wonder if there's an alternative to that. As part of that procedural justice, so bringing people to the table. But maybe if it turns out that there is an area where it just makes more sense for whatever reason that infrastructure has to plow through an area where there's a marginalized community, how do you compensate them for that, instead of just allowing them to be the quote unquote losers? Yeah, so I feel like moving forward, we like that's a mindset that I'm struggling with right now, and how that fits in a just energy future. How we can reconcile that with energy justice.
Yeah, I think it's hard, right? And these are very nuanced conversations. And the reality is that the status quo is that those with more wealth and political power are going to have a bigger say in the decision. And trying to create procedural mechanisms that prevent that, I think, is really important. So in the housing example, right, it's so that the people who already own housing, for instance, can't say, nobody gets to build more housing because it would hurt me. And we're not going to think about all the other people, maybe, who would like to live here, or the chain of events that would lead to housing becoming more affordable in that area. So I think, there's an analog here where the solution to that isn't necessarily saying some other group has equal power to say, not in my backyard, but it's that you ideally want to create some kind of procedure where everybody has a seat at the decision-making table, and you do compensate losers. You come to some kind of agreement that does seem reasonable or fair to everyone involved. Very much easier said than done, but I think the little bit of controversial point I wanted to add was that I don't think procedural justice necessarily means that you want to have strictly local decision-making authority, that could potentially backfire.
Yeah, no, I to just emphasize that point, like I do think that is one of the work of Ostrom's work on this layered management of common pool resources. I think it reflects that there are instances where the local interests do need to carry weight. There are instances where you need to balance local interests against the broader common pooled resources. It also, in this conversation, I teased earlier, like all of this work on justice throughout the history of moral theory. But one of the reasons I like that the energy justice community centered on justice is because of the difference between equality, equity, and justice. And ultimately, my view of justice is in a lot of ways it's in harmony of interests, right? It is not a strict equality amongst all participants. It is a harmony of making sure your interests and preferences and priorities are reflective and given the right weight, the correct weight, not necessarily equal weight. And that for me is one of the areas of this work that I'm glad that is emphasized in this, that we're talking about trying to make it a just energy transition. And we're given, in some instances for marginalized communities, in the aspect of like restorative justice and recognitional justice, it is meant to be a reflection that you do need to prioritize their interests over some other groups that have not been historically marginalized, because that is just. That is a reflection of the disparities that have been taken on in the past that you need to make sure you're reflecting in harmony, not necessarily with equal weight.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And if we're thinking about, Erin Baker, of course, is an operations researcher. If we're thinking about modeling something like this, you're saying, well, the horizon we're looking at is much broader than just the future. We're also looking at the past, and we know that some of those past decisions were fixed. So given those past fixed decisions, how do we make the most just, and we've got to figure out what exactly you mean by that, of course, but the most just decisions moving forward.
Well said. Yeah.
So I'm gonna if we've got time, Paul, I'm gonna pose a conundrum for y'all. And we've been talking about a lot in many other podcasts and with guests about market design, right? And one of the aspects of market design we've all talked about: consumer enablement, load flexibility, giving consumers to opportunity to engage, participate in the markets, especially because you've got distributed energy resources, all these cool things, Google Home, whatever the technology, maybe not to use this manufacturer, but yeah, we've got all these great technologies in the home now. But the very idea of running a spot market is to be able to reconcile not only who can supply energy at the cheapest cost, but who is willing but also able to pay for energy at particular points and time, places and time. So in person, and that is an ability to pay and willingness to pay. Mm-hmm. Now, how does that reconcile with energy justice? First point. And then my second point is, should we be creating an ideal, should we kind of incorporate energy justice into the market design, or should we strive to create just the ideal market design and then deal with energy justice or subsidization or costs kind of that outside of the design or as an overlay? So that's my question to you all.
I'm glad you asked. This marries the reason we're having a lot of these conversations. The reason we had the conversation with Lynn about Ostrom's work is because I think this insight into the hierarchy and layering of governance in a common pooled resource is, for me, key to this question. Because my perspective is, as you've heard me say before, electric utilities provide a pooling of priorities amongst communities. And I think there is a role for, whether it be public power or other types of electric utilities, retail service providers, to be reflective of those priorities for the local community. And I've come back to this over and over again. There are policy choices that are rightly centered within the community about things like line extension policy, things about grid and line edge incentives and homes, and how you treat those customers that are at the edge of your service territory. Those, for me, are rightly centered in the utility, and a utility can rightly decide that a spot price amongst its participants is the right way for their community to reflect that cost difference. It is also, I think, also a just and reasonable answer for an electric utility to come up with a standard tariff for service in its territory, and then develop programs that are consistent with energy justice measures for participants in its grid to reflect those price disparities and to effectively pool whatever that spot price for their system is across all participants. I view this question of how to marry electric market design with the grid edge and spot prices for consumers as a function that is necessary within our energy system to reflect amongst communities the disparate interests of communities and the disparate experiences of our communities. A rural electric service provider can have a very different and reasonable understanding of how to allocate that spot price than a urban community. A community with a lot of historically marginalized communities may also decide how to treat spot prices differently. I think it is still very valuable to understand and have transparency to spot price on distribution networks, but I think it is up to the community to decide how it prioritizes using that for electric service. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
You know what? That was a fantastic question, Farhad. And in your
I just
question,
asked it. You guys have to answer it.
okay, what's funny? Your question had embedded in it my vision for an energy just future, or a just energy future. So where everybody has not just the willingness to pay for their electricity, but the ability to pay where they are and at the time that they need it, because that's not always the case right now. But the question going back to, is it, do we need to embed energy justice into our current, our market framework, or deal with it in the aftermath? I'm a both and in this case, because we just can't seem to get markets right. There's we as much as we try, and you're supposed to try as much as, as best you can. So if in an ideal world we could embed energy justice into our markets perfectly, that would be my preference. I prefer getting to root causes than band-aids at the end of the day. That's my personal preference. But I know we're always imperfect, and so you'll need those other solutions after the fact anyway. But I'm thinking about the national lab, some of the work that they're doing, looking just at how do you incorporate energy justice into your dispatch. So taking, for example, pollution and where that pollution is happening with these different communities, and incorporating that into a just dispatch. Just some very interesting work that the national labs have going on. I don't think that's going to replace the need to still have programs or some sort of other policies or procedures in place to fill the gaps where the markets still tend to fail and to produce just outcomes.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Farhad. I can take a stab at how I would think about answering this. So if we're trying to say that we'd like to find the efficient solution, right? The social welfare maximizing solution. But then within that, perhaps we have different metrics that we also think are important, such as fairness, which might be based on, say, income level of household and how much we think somebody should be, spending as a percentage of their income on energy. And then there might be room, afterwards to do some, redistribution, but perhaps you have some options for how you would think about doing that. But as for that first step, so thinking about how would we get to that most efficient solution? Well, I think, pretty along the lines of the resource adequacy talk that I gave, that what you would want to do is have some kind of, mandatory forward contracting for small consumers that you could opt out of, right? And so you have as this base level a protection for those who are least able to change their consumption in response to price, right? Because ultimately, what we don't want to have again or repeatedly into the future is other Winter Storm Uris, where you have a situation in which prices are very high for a sustained period of time. The regulator has to intervene. All these consumers were not hedged. It's not a great situation. So maybe one solution could be that you have the base of small consumers who are hedged by default. And there's a lot of debate about how exactly you would implement that and how hard it would be. But that could probably allow for the spot market prices that, Farhad and I talk about. Like, it'd be great if you could allow those spot market prices to get higher, but politically you can't do it if it's going to hurt a big political vulnerable contingency, right? So I think that would be one way to think about doing this. And then, you have people who can respond. So, the EV havers, heat pumps, etc., who are able to participate as flexible demand. But importantly, you want to compensate them, at the value they're providing. You don't want to have net metering 2.0 where, you're overcompensating somebody for the value they're providing to the grid. So I think that is really important when thinking about how you're designing those kinds of participation programs, that you're not, inadvertently ending up with a cross subsidy between a wealthier portion of your consumers and a less wealthy portion of your consumers. But then on the flip side of that, or on the back end of that rather, you could have a situation like that. And I could imagine at the end of the day, what that might look like is that a wealthy household is spending a lot less on energy than a non-wealthy household, especially if they're able, to use these, different time of use rates or dynamic pricing to charge their EV. And then we have to think, societally, like, are we okay with that? Perhaps we are, or maybe, we think that there's some other way we want to do some kind of redistribution. It doesn't necessarily have to come via the energy tariff. This is something maybe we think this works itself out via how we do income taxes. There's quite a big system to think about when we're considering, what level of burden for that the energy service is on each household. But yeah, could get complicated fast.
Now, I'm glad you integrated the forward markets or the hedge, because whether we want to use those terms or not, I think that's an important aspect when you come to justice, because some folks may not be able to, like, when you think about, there is kind of an implicit, consideration when you think about, like, let's say emergency situations where you have randomized brownouts, right? In those situations where, I guess the principle was, well, everyone kind of gets an equal chance at being interrupted, and then we can kind of keep rolling it across the system so that no one group or folks are continuously, interrupted. And I think one of the other ways also of thinking about this is, because energy is kind of one of those things which there's essential components, but then there's also potentially non-essential components, right? So can we hedge these essential levels of demand? And maybe if we have to, once we get to having to curtail those, that might be randomized, but then over and above, you could have people that could respond, that maybe they can respond flexibly, they can adapt their usage in that situation. So that's probably my contribution to that question. But yeah, really good answers. I really like the discussion here.
Well, that was your unfair question of the week. In the interview, Ahlmahz as an unfair question of Professor Baker, and we used to have a segment in season 5. It was a recurring segment, Ahlmahz's unfair question of the week, and it got me leaning to, like, maybe Ahlmahz, you can ask. This is our final episode as a group. The season finale will be a live event. It won't be like this. So Ahlmahz, do you want to ask the same unfair question to Farhad and Conleigh?
Yeah, well, let's just distill it to concrete terms that everybody can understand. The question is, what does a just energy future look like to you?
I was gonna turf it to
I feel lucky.
Conleigh. push it. Now you can see that I'm biting for time here, right? Like, so what does a perfect energy world look like? I think
is that the same? Wait! Before you do this, are you in the perfect energy world?
Have I done the
just energy
future?
Yes, you have. You have.
Answering the question.
Yeah, we
I wanna
figured
ask
out
you.
economic fusion. It's all
Right.
fine now, guys. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. Oh, like not with the perfect one. What's a just energy future, right, Ahlmahz?
That was the quote. But does he interpret just as meaning perfect? That's what I understood. So, but the question was just.
I was doing a politician's change, I'm sure. Either implicitly or otherwise. But so I think the vision should be of access to energy opportunities, I guess, is where I would probably look at that as being where inevitably there will be folks that have different flexibilities, have different ability and willingness to pay. I think there is a beauty in designing markets and getting innovation going, and getting competition going. I think there's a really positive outcomes from those types of engagements. But I think also when you think about the inevitable inequitable impacts of some of those issues, to me, it's just making sure that there is base levels, there's access to the core aspects of energy, which are there's essentiality written all over them. I mean, it's the standard, food, clothing, shelter. Energy is implicit in all of those. So to me, there's that base level that we've got to think about how we design markets and regulations with that base level in mind. But then also beyond that, obviously there's technology, there's a flexible, more flexibility in that. So having also then harnessing those opportunities too. So it's a very I think it's a hard, really hard basket and a really tough question. But to me, it's just trying to figure out what's the access, what's the right level of access that everyone should have to the system.
Yeah, good question, but difficult to sum up quickly. So maybe this is a little too close to Farhad's answer, but I would say something like everyone has access to energy in a way that reflects their underlying utility function. So by that, I mean, if you are in a vulnerable situation during a prolonged storm, you have access to the energy that will, keep you at a baseline level of wellness. But at the same time, if you wanted to heat a pool at a time when the system was under great strain, you would be charged at a rate that would reflect that, so that you would be appropriately incentivized perhaps not to do that. So I think that is, part of having a just energy system in the end. But of course, there's a lot of aspects to that. I think Farhad and I very much focused on, maybe the electricity and energy market aspect to it. But if we're being really pedantic, maybe I can say, in that utility function, we're also going to embed things like, your exposure to local pollutants, and that all of that is also, reflected. But it's a difficult problem. But I think the idea to keep the focus on a very broad understanding of, what is your system and what is your horizon, that maybe it's bigger and longer than you previously thought, I think is a good guiding mantra for thinking about energy justice.
What's your vision of a just energy future?
I have no intention of getting away free. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this. I have a philosophical question that I ask almost everybody I know. I ask, is poverty necessary, and will it always exist? That's something, just as a humanitarian, that's something that occupies my mind a lot. Is poverty necessary? So now let's put in energy poverty necessary, and will it always exist? So for me, a just energy system is a system that has no systemic disparities. So like there might be, like taking this analogy with poverty, somebody who is, perfectly able-bodied, can work, can take care of themselves, and one day gets into a tragic accident. They have no family, and suddenly they become dependent and need assistance in some type of way. Like that, those kinds of situations will always exist. So there will, for some people, circumstances will cause them to be in poverty, even perhaps energy poverty. And I don't know, like when I answer that question that I ask everybody else, I don't know that we will ever be able to completely eliminate poverty, even energy poverty. But a just system is one where we aren't the ones causing the disparities. So that's why I say, for me, the vision of a just energy future is an energy system that has zero systemic institutional cause disparities.
I think that's an interesting observation, although I guess I would push back a little bit and say that in that example, perhaps we would say that, collectively as a society, if we were going to have a just energy system, it would be our obligation to do something to support the person in the situation that you outlined,
Absolutely.
right? And that would be part of it.
Oh, absolutely. So I don't believe that we'll ever, so my vision of a just future doesn't mean that those situations will not exist. Because I feel like they will exist in the future. But a just energy future is one in which the energy system itself isn't the cause of injustices and disparities amongst people. But yes, I totally agree that society does have an obligation to ensure. So like I still agree. So like my first point that I gave when Farhad first gave the question. So the ability and the willingness to have energy where you need it and when you need it and the amount that you need. That's the first component of my vision for an energy, a just energy future. But that second part has to do with where the source, eliminating systemic sources of inequities, even if we can't get rid of all of them altogether.
Beautiful. Great answers. I'll bracket my answer. I'll provide something. I'll bracket my answer with two other sources of this type of vision. First, we had a beautiful conversation with Professor Destiny Knock, in which we just talked to her about this concept of utility maximization, where you are trying to develop a system with general access and planning for people's needs and making sure you are building a system that provides that indiscriminate kind of no institutional disparity model. I'll also bracket it on the other side. In the interview with Professor Destiny Knock, I referenced this solar punk fiction, which is like this science fiction future. I looked it up. It's Becky Chambers wrote the Monk and Robot series. One is A Psalm for the Wild Built. The second is A Prayer for the Crowned Shy. And it is in some ways a vision of rightly placed energy needs. It is not so much the ubiquitous energy supply. It is more centering your world and your community around a right-sized energy need, which I thought, of course, it's fiction, science fiction, but it's a different vision of the future where it is not all of the energy you can consume. But in some ways, to your point, Conleigh, it's like having access to your what's the economic term? It's like what's your maximization of your benefit from it, which isn't all you can consume, and it's not a necessary that you keep consuming to what you are priced to consume. It's more like, what is my right-sized use of energy? It's really a beautiful series. I can't recommend it enough. My wife, who's not a reader, but I got her to read these books. They're very short. You can breeze through them. They're great. A great genre and a great vision of the future that's different from where we'll end up. But it's good to have flex that muscle. There's different worlds that you can read about and learn about and think about. I'll hit the typewriter and post, and then we're gonna close it out. This is the last regular episode. I talked about this. Conleigh, Farhad, you aren't going to make the trek, or you can't make the trek all the way to the Pacific Northwest for our season finale halfway across the world. I wanted to provide just a chance in our last gathering like this in this forum recorded on Zoom. Any closing thoughts, Farhad?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here with such a brilliant group of folks. It's been an absolute pleasure to just chat about these very interesting, very wonky topics maybe for everyone, but I think there's a groundswell of folks this is their world, and so this is something that I've really enjoyed. I guess my closing thought would maybe to our listeners would be, as you think about the issues that you're dealing with in your job or work or even just interest, think about the mirror test. When you face yourself in the mirror and actually think about the core issues at play, that's you're kind of talking to yourself about making those calls. And so to me, that's a really important aspect whenever we're talking about these issues, is drop all the embedded positions you may have because of what you work and what you're doing, but just think about what's the right outcomes, or at least what's the right questions, I think, rather than the outcomes.
Thank you, Farhad. How about you, Conleigh? Any closing thoughts for our audience?
Well, first of all, yes, again, just to echo what Farhad said, thanks a lot for having us. It's been really great getting to have these conversations with the four of us together. I've certainly, learned a lot about extemporaneous speaking doing these interviews. Yeah, I guess a closing thought would be that, the energy transition is probably going to be longer than any of us are anticipating. So, it's we're in it for the long haul, and it can be helpful, I think, to just remember what our long-term goal is, and to think about how the small things that we're doing right now will put us on the path we want to go on eventually.
Can you imagine what the world is going to look like in 40 years? And when I hear you say the transition is going to take a lot longer than any of us are thinking, like we've been thinking 2050 for a long time, but how about this? In 40 years, let's dig up this episode. Say, how has the world changed?
Yeah, luckily, hopefully I'm around in those 40 years. I've said it before, I'll say it again. It is not lost on me how lucky we are to have you two inspirational thought leaders in the electric market design and in the energy sector spend these countless hours working with Ahlmahz and I on the episodes and recording these. So thank you for all your insights, your wit, your wisdom, and your time. It is very much valued and appreciated. I hope you've felt seen and heard. Conleigh, do you feel seen and heard? Have you felt valued and appreciated?
I do. Thank you, Paul.
How about you, Farhad? Has this made you feel seen and heard and valued and appreciated?
Very much so. And thank you to all of you guys for making it happen.
And Ahlmahz, we get to close this out in person on Sunday. And I'll ask you it again then, but do you feel seen and heard and valued and appreciated?
Absolutely. All the time, Paul. Actually,
Good.
Here we go. I had to. Oh, it looks cute.
Got some Zoom emojis on the screen. Hopefully that comes through in the recording. To our listeners, while you aren't seen or heard, you are valued and appreciated. Roll on, enthusiasts. Roll on.
We started in hard times to bring us all into the laughter through thick and through thin for public power enthusiasts.
Public Power Underground is a production of News Data and Seattle City Light. You don't have to be subscribed to News Data's weekly newsletter to get this podcast, but it sure makes the podcast make a lot more sense. The views expressed here are own and not the official views of Seattle City Light, Tacoma Power, S&P Global, News Data, or the organization of the guests also appearing on Public Power Underground. Today's episode was written and produced by Paul Dockery, Ahlmahz Negash, Conleigh Byers, and Farhad Billimoria, and it's edited and published by the stellar team of Pioneer Utility Resources with sound mixing by Lucas Smith and video editing by Brendan Delzer. Our theme song, Roll On Enthusiast, was rewritten, performed, and recorded by Aaron Guillory and Ian Bledsoe. You can find Public Power Underground on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Please share with the energy enthusiasts in your life and give us a rating and review on your app of choice if you enjoyed the content. It helps other energy enthusiasts like us find us. Public Power Underground for electric utility enthusiasts. Public Power Underground, it's work to watch.